Cate Stillman is known worldwide as the yoga healer. She has been practicing Ayurvedic for decades, and she has led people through numerous different programs on rewilding their health, from cleansing and fasting to yoga retreats to leadership retreats to really becoming the master of you. She's an author and a super cool human who really cares about the earth and humanity. So welcome, Cate. We are thrilled to be in the room with you. So thanks for your time here.
Yeah, go gardeners.
Yeah, go gardeners. Yeah. And one other thing is Cate's just launched a really cool, her newest project is Club Thrive Global, which we'll maybe touch on a bit later. So first of all, Cate, we're talking about thriving with weeds and really rewilding our health through foraging and eating wild and gardening. And I'm just wondering, what does that mean to you when you think about that?
Yeah, well, I'm sure many of you gardeners can relate. Like at some point in your gardening experience, and you're wondering, like, there's the seeds that you're sowing, and then there's the plants that are growing. And you might at some point wonder, like, why you're weeding out certain things that seem to want to grow in certain places in your yard or in certain spots in your beds. And that's really where I got curious in my research and in my interviews with Katrina Blair, who's the author of The Wisdom of Wild Weeds. What surfaces is that the wild weeds have a much higher nutrient density profile than a lot of the plants that we're growing. And so for me, coming from the health and wellness space, that was particularly curious, where I just started to look around of like what's naturally growing. Those of you who are permaculturists are already attuned to this, of like what's naturally growing where. And then as we look into when we look at our relationship with plants, we might look at certain plants as food, and then we might look at other plants as medicine. And when we start to take more of a medicinal approach, that's to me where the weeds get really interesting. If we look at how like the Native Americans used a lot of the plants, and in the Americas, a lot of those don't even hit the modern interpretation of medicinals, but boy, when you start using them, you really start to wake up your palate and you wake up your more primal nature. So that's for me sort of where it all begins.
And and that's why I wanted to bring you in for this conversation, because I don't know that you were really a gardener. It was almost like you were an e-reader before you were a gardener. Is that true?
I mean, it's a really good question. I years ago, like maybe 15 years ago, started doing these like Witch on a Mountain Bike series where I would just be, I live in a place that's surrounded by national forests. So I live out in the Teton Mountains, and I love to ride my bike. And so I would just notice like patches of currants and, patches of thistle and nettle, and places where like the dandelion greens just looked phenomenal, like better than anything I could buy at the store, And so I was gardening though. Like I was trying to garden in a pretty tough climate. So we're zone 4, high winds, very arid. It's pretty tough unless you can create an atmosphere within your yard that protects from everything just like getting baked and dried out in our super short growing season. My husband just took the plow and plowed out the yard so it would dry out this like just 2 days ago. So it's a super short growing season where I am, but the weeds, they grow fast, and they grow with so much nutrient density that, yeah, I mean, fair enough. I was definitely eating a lot more from foraging than from what I could produce in my garden initially.
That's so cool. What are some of your favorite weeds and why?
Well, the one that, like the first green powders that I would make from my yard were from chickweed, which was a volunteer in my beds, and that one has a really lovely energetic. Those of you who have a ton of chickweed, and it can be super invasive in your beds when you don't want it. I would just let it grow, pull it all out, and then dry it and powder it. It has my background's in Ayurvedic medicine, and the thing about chickweed is it's a bitter, but it's a sweet bitter.
Mhm.
uh, which is unusual, where most of the greens don't also have sweet. Um, a wild a wild plant out here that's really hard to cultivate. I don't think you would ever cultivate, but you might come across if you live in the Northwest, is sweet cicely, which is also somewhat similar to chickweed in the sense that it's a really soft, delicate, almost sweet, while falling in the category of bitters. Thistle is my like a number one go-to. Like thistle is insane in terms of its nutrient density, its ability to build blood, to build uh, basically what we're missing in our nutrient density as modern humans. Thistle is an enemy often to gardeners. People often hate thistle, and they often spray it with petrochemicals. So it can be a real problem. However, thistle is also a much sweeter weed than dandelion.
Mhm.
And so it's excellent for the kidneys, for the liver, for your blood, for your heart. I mean, you really can't name an organ where it won't help, especially if you have any sort of stagnation in your body, which you would know you had stagnation if you're carrying a few extra pounds. If you have any type of skin issues or allergies, these greens are super helpful. So what I would do with the thistle, because the thistle, those of you do you guys know what I mean with thistle? Like there's like 100 different varieties, and it's super prickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the prickly lettuces are also like this, the wild lettuces that we often just huck, but they're everywhere and they'll grow as weeds in our garden. I just dry them. I just basically like pull them from the root up. I have a big bucket of water, put them in the bucket of water. The more tender for thistle, the better. So before it's above 2 feet is when I'm cultivating my thistle. And with thistle, you can pull the root and don't worry, it'll grow right back. Those taproots go close to 30 feet. So it'll just keep regenerating. And I just like put them in the bucket, all the bugs fall out. I pull off any kind of brown parts. And then I just like throw it on a table in the sun for like a day and just get some of the big water out, get it to wilt. And then I stick it in a huge dehydrator. I use the Excalibur
Mhm.
10 tray because it's got you can just put a mound of stuff in there for days. And then I put it in a paper bag and crush it down, put it in my blender, make it into a powder, and then I keep it for green smoothies and anything I just want to just get a shot of green. And I'll just even mix it with water and just supplement that way.
That is awesome. Yeah, I didn't lean into weeds very much. I kind of grew up eating weeds naturally. We had dandelion and stinging nettle. My mom would steam it. It wasn't my favorite thing, but sometimes I liked it. Um, Chickweed, we ate a lot of sorrel. I don't know if anyone has sorrel, but it's one of my favorites. It's like eating heaven. It's really like tangy and delicious. But my point is when I moved to Saskatchewan, I can't say I almost starved because I'm still very healthy, but I starved for healthy food. I starved for organic food because it was really hard to get out here and the growing season was super short. So I started to look at what was growing and started to lean heavier um, into the weeds and include like my salads became weed salads and without even people knowing. And Alana, who's on here, actually, she stayed with me for a few months last year and we harvested weeds and made our own weed powder. And she puts it on everything. I put it on a lot, but she puts it on everything like toast, eggs, um, like anything she's eating, almost she puts it on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're going to find there's just massive nutrient density in terms of vitamins, but also in terms of minerals with thistle. So much of we all know that our soil is increasingly depleted. So
Mhm.
when you find a plant that sends a taproot beneath the disturbed soil, that's where you're going to get mineral density in the plants, right? So with thistle, and an easy way to do thistle too is you harvest it with gloves because it's crazy prickly. Gloves and scissors, you just cut the freshest leaves off of it. I always chop the top off it so it doesn't flower and regenerate because there's plenty of it worldwide. We're not going to have a thistle shortage. And blending it with a little bit of lemon and apples and water. And it's super easy just to, for those of you who like green smoothies in the morning, it's just an easy, quick beverage to make.
Mhm.
But when you
And
get these plants that are pulling minerals, and that's what I kind of want to drive to is like looking at these plants that are pulling minerals from way beneath the disturbed soil, and they're regenerative plants. They're permaculture plants. So if you look at a thistle, the reason we don't want to spray our thistle, right, is it's actually regenerating the nutrients on the topsoil. Because as that thistle dies, come winter, and the plant falls back to the earth, right, all those minerals go back into the topsoil.
What I'm hearing and understanding is that weeds are actually more nutrient dense than some of the crops that we grow in our gardens. And so help me understand how that like rewilds my health. You know, like you've given us a little bit, but really
Yeah.
give us a bit deeper with that.
Yeah, so in Ayurvedic medicine, we have the six taste profiles. So we have sweet, bitter, pungent, salty, astringent, sweet, bitter, salty. What did I miss? Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, astringent. There we go. So the greens are primarily bitter and astringent. The mustard greens will also have pungent. Plants like sorrel are going to be higher in sour and astringent, but they're all going to have bitter. And bitter is has a scraping action. And so it'll literally scrape some of the inflammation out of the tissues of our body. And because modern culture, like we have so many, we're just surrounded by so much toxicity. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think we all know it, right? We have endocrine disrupting chemicals. Every baby is born with like 60 to 100 endocrine disrupting chemicals already in their physiology. And so the way I take it is like, okay, we're survivors, right? Like we're all gonna be like, let's be survivors, let's be thrivers. Like we probably can't change Dow Chemicals, their corporate plan for 2023. But what we can do is assist our physiology with deep nutrition. And so what these bitters and astringents will do is they'll particularly cleanse the fat tissue, the adipose tissue. So the fat tissue of our body is where the endocrine disrupting chemicals are stored. And when we look at what's the part of the problem with that is the more endocrine disrupting chemicals we have in our fat tissue, the more the fat cells are actually creating markers for chronic inflammation in the blood. So they'll actually increase the inflammatory response of our physiology. So we'll have more chronic inflammation, which for some of us, that means joint pain. For some of us, that means really sensitive skin. For some of us, that means like weight creep or the bloat, or problems with deep nutrient absorption and digestion at the cellular level. So the bitters are better, and that's just a thing that like in Ayurveda we always say like bitters are better. So the amount of bitter we need now is just greater than it's ever been, because it can help kind of scrape the toxicity and pull some detox some of the fat tissue, so it can just function how it's meant to function. So we now know that fat tissue or adipose tissue is the largest endocrine organ in the body. And this is new. We didn't know that until about 2022 in terms of like modern scientific literature. And now that we know that it's our fat tissue that's controlling our endocrine glands, all of our hormonal systems, right? That becomes increasingly important, especially those who are, more affected, whether it's from PMS, whether it's in pregnancy, whether perimenopausal or postmenopausal, where you're wanting like the highest functioning endocrine system that you can have. So that's just one way. That's just one way of looking at it. There's so many other ways of looking at it, of just like, if you have osteoporosis and you want deep mineral density, right, in your just in your nutrient intake, right, not through supplementation, but through food, because the body absorbs so much better through food. So one of the ways that I get even more absorption is through fermenting. So doing like fermented gut shots with thistle. So it's like, to me, a gut shot is just like the juice. It's like sauerkraut juice or pickle juice, where you could take thistle leaves, and instead of making sauerkraut, you could make it with thistle. And then you could just use the liquid, and now you have a very deep mineral profile and a very absorbable form in a fermented form.
So do you combine the thistle and the cabbage together to make that?
You could, because the cabbage is really high in lactobacillus and other types of probiotic organisms.
Oh, that's really cool. I fermented dandelions for the first time last year, and they're delicious. It's similar flavor to seaweed if a person likes seaweed. That's what it was for me anyways. It was really, yeah, they're yummy.
Yeah, and you can taste the minerals in thistle-based gut shots.
Yeah,
Like it almost feels like bone broth. So especially for those who are vegan and wanting the effects of bone broth, but not wanting to eat animals.
really. And so you could ferment them on their own if you wanted as well.
Yeah, like I mean, everything rots, right? Like everything ferments. The
Yeah.
composters out here get it. But the more species you have in your ferments, the more the increase in microbial diversity of that fermented food. So even if you're making sauerkraut, if you add, if you add some carrots, if you add a little bit of onion, you're going to have an increase of microbial diversity. Right now, like FYI, humans are down 30% of our microbial diversity, and our microbiome is considered an organ now as well. So if you think of your heart operating at 100%, now think of having a third less of your heart. And that's where we are as a species in terms of our microbial diversity, is we're down over 30%. You guys probably aren't as low being gardeners because your hands are in the soil. And having your hands in the soil and picking your nose, that's a really good combo, right? Like mixing cow manure into the soil with your hands and picking your nose is the best combo, especially if you're getting your cow manure from a biodynamic cow.
That's right.
That's where the leading research goes. You guys can read it in the chapter in my newest book, which is free on Amazon right now. It's called Uninflamed 21 Primal Habits. And the chapter that we're talking about right now is called Eat Dirty. And it's about how do we return microbial diversity back into our body. It's also great, it's great to get dirt on your skin. It's great to get cow manure on your skin, especially anyone who's suffering from allergies or dermatitis or any sort of psoriasis or skin issues. It means that there's just really low microbial diversity in your skin microbiome.
Tell us more about eating dirty.
Well, I mean, it really comes to okay, if we go back to, okay, well, first of all, I like to think in terms of the scope of humans and time. So I'm very much a big picture thinker, big picture problem solver. So if we look historically, human brain size has shrunk 10% since the advent of agriculture. Agriculture is about 10,000 years old. So what does that mean? It means the more we store food in our cupboards and the more we just snack throughout the day, rather than fasting, rather than like working up an appetite to digest the next meal, the more we actually go into degeneration as a species. Now, microbiome diversity wasn't really lost. This is super interesting to me until we left the farm, for the factory. And if we look at why, it's because we were mining the microbiome of cows. We were milking the cow and picking our nose. Right. And so the cow's grazing in the field, right? The cow's eating all the different plants they're not differentiating. This is a weed from this is grass, right? They're eating everything in the field. They're pooping it out. It goes through all four stomachs. We take the cow poop. Every farm had a garden, right? And just besides the farming, they had their own little family garden. They'd mix the cow manure into the garden soil, and then they'd pick their nose or scratch their cut, right? Get a little dirt on your skin and you're picking up 400 bacteria and literally tens of thousands of viruses. And the virome is really where a lot of genetic diversity is stored that feeds the microbiome, which feeds the human DNA cells. So when we cut off from farming, that's when we lost this connection to the what's called cowpathy in India. So it's like the cow as pharmacy. So the cow milk, the cow yogurt, the cow ghee, the cow poop, even the cow urine is used on a holistic farm for all sorts of, not just to nutrify the soil and fertilize the soil, but also to heal wounds, and also obviously primarily as food. So our disconnect from the cow, it was our disconnect from the soil. Soil has more microbial diversity than cow manure. So it's soil first, then cow manure, and then everything else. But by the time you leave soil and cow manure, at this point, you're usually fighting for microbial diversity. And just as a side note, the FDA in the United States just passed their first fecal, it's basically like fecal pill where you can supplement, right, microbial diversity from someone else's poop. We're not going to need that even if you have IBS or Crohn's or whatever. If you just simply garden and mix cow manure in with the soil, you're going to get that microbial diversity. So for those of you who always have the garden gloves on, like, don't occasionally, like, take them off. Get more microbial exposure. And the same thing with when you're washing your veggies and whatnot. It's like, get a little dirt in your mouth, right? Like, don't scrub all the dirt off the carrots. They shouldn't look like the carrots in the store. You should have a little bit of dirt. Don't peel the skins. So most of the microbial diversity that comes into the plant is on the skin. So you wanna have raw skins. Or for those of you who are doing living foods, like anything that's cooked above 120 degrees is gonna kill the microbes. So keeping it below, at least some of the foods below that temperature. And that's where fermenting is great, because for those of you who struggle with digestion of raw foods, fermenting is where you're cooking it, but in a breakdown of fermentation rather than using heat. And that actually will grow the microbial diversity.
There's a good little question here. It says, does sheep manure have the same potency as cow manure for biome effect?
That's a really good question. And we're not even talking about urine yet. Some of the best studies from Ayurvedic medicine and from the best ancient texts really go into all the different animal urines as having different medicinal profiles. I don't know about sheep. What I know about cow is there's something to that four stomachs and the massive intake of chlorophyll, which is part of why it was such a supplemental microbiome to the humans. My guess is like any animal manure will do. The studies on even just having a dog in a household with this is really interesting. If a household has a dog, the chance of the children being on medication goes way down, because children on our medication, in the United States, 1/3 of the children are on medication right now. 1/3, yeah. And what they're on medication for is allergies, asthma, or ectopic dermatitis, and those are all part of the immune function. So just by a household having a dog, because what does the dog do? The dog goes to the dog park, and what does the dog do at the dog park? It sniffs the other dog's poop, right? And it's pulling in microbial diversity. Then you pet the dog licks you, you pet the dog, now the microbial diversity is transferred to you. So now you have strong terrain. So it's the opposite. Those who, we're going into terrain theory versus germ theory. That's also an uninflamed if you want to learn more about it. But the stronger your terrain, the more diverse your terrain is in terms of microbial, different types of microbes, bacteria, and viruses, the stronger your immune system is. Then you have resilience. And that's why the kids in those households would have better immune resilience, get fewer colds, get less sick when they get sick, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And so, Cate, is part of what you learned that, let me back it up a little bit. What we are learning is that composted manure is probably some of the richest, best manure to put into the garden is when it's fully composted. And what I'm hearing from you is that maybe also working with, is it raw manure or is it composted manure that we're putting into the garden, or,
and you guys, I am like the biggest gardening hack. So I like full disclosure here. I'm much more of a wildcrafter than I am a gardener. I mean, I have a greenhouse. It is planted. I mostly grow like lettuce and onions and basil and kale and collards. But because we have such a short and peas, but because we have such a short growing season, I'm like not the queen. I get manure from my farmer and I just mix it in with soil. And but I'm not sure for like how long you want to let it bake in the sun and all of that sort of thing. There is, I'm going to go way out there for those of you who haven't totally freaked out enough yet. The medicine from Ayurveda, and Ayu means life, Veda means to know, and this is the medicine from India. So there's Chinese medicine, there's Indian medicine. The medicine from India is called Ayurveda, and that's what I'm a specialist in, is in Ayurvedic medicine. And that's what brought me into a lot of this research and looking at, well, most humans right now are suffering from diseases of chronic inflammation. All the autoimmune diseases are chronic inflammation. All the diabetes and weight diseases are chronic inflammation. All the allergies and immune diseases are chronic inflammation, right? So 100 years ago, people were dying of acute infection. Now people are just, they're not even, I mean, they are 3 out of 5 people worldwide are dying of chronic inflammation, but most of us just suffer, right? Suffer with bloat or suffer with itchy skin or suffer with joint pain, and all that is that. So there was this medicine back in the day, 2,000 years ago, written about in the Ayurvedic text. It's called Panchagavya, and it's like, and it's the ways of taking the cow as medicine and compacting it into something that you could easily travel with. And it was cow poop, cow urine, cow ghee, cow yogurt, and what did I miss? Cow. I think I got it. And you cook it down. So you do boil it. So you boil off some of the bacteria. But you would take that internally. You put it in the nose, you put it in the mouth, put it in the anus, and it completely restores the microbiome. So when I look at stuff like that, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of different ways. Those of you who have access to good cow manure, and that means like a cow that's not getting shot up with all sorts of hormones and not getting dosed with antibiotics, then there's just so much there that you can use in your gardens. And honestly, just like a shovel will do for diversity for you for the entire year. It's not a lot. And just mixing some into your soil, can go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to circle back to the composting piece, is what we're learning is the microbiology in composted manure is exponential. It changes the life of the manure. So that would be interesting just to learn a little bit more about the Ayurvedic
and the health of the plants.
Yeah.
Right? Because then the plants you're gonna have less infestation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, 100%. And that's what's interesting about Rudolf Steiner's work in the biodynamics, is that composting and using cow manure and animal manure is one of the things he brought back into farming when people were having a hard time with farming and not being able to grow anything. So it's very, very fascinating.
Well, and then that also goes to using cow and human urine as nitrogen fixing fertilizers, right? And that we were talking before about the article in the New York Times. I don't know if anyone caught the pee upcyclers article in the New York Times a few months ago, but there's a nonprofit that's helping basically gather pee for larger scale farms that don't want to use chemical or synthetic fertilizers. And so humans have always used urine because it's super high in nitrogen, right? Urea and uric acid are super high in nitrogen. So pee, it off gases ammonia. And then as it ages, it becomes more and more nutrient dense. Interestingly enough, it grows growth hormone and stem cells. And so humans have always mixed urine, cow manure and cow urine and human urine to spray their beds. And actually, the fertilizer I was talking about before that, Panchagavya, and I can give you some links, Natalie. In India, they use Panchagavya, so cow poop, cow pee, cow milk, cow ghee, and cow yogurt, and they mix that with fruit, usually like grapes, and they make a huge vat with water and grapes. They let it ferment 30 days, then they spray the fields like that. Rudolf Steiner, they kind of do part of that where they bury the horn. This is like on a whole other level. They'll spray acres and acres and acres of crops, and they'll just get so much more nutrient density. They're going to get so much less infestation. And the thing is the farmers are healthier because now everybody's microbiome's more diverse. Yeah, super fascinating. It's like what we think we know, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some people, I'm just going to go right into the chat here because I don't lose things. Bob says clean pee is good for herbs and the compost and in compost. And China uses urine to fertilize fields, but recommends cooking the vegetables before eating.
In China, they use a lot of what's called night soil. So they use a lot of human manure in China. Hopefully we'll see a return to that in more places rather than increasing our waste streams.
Yeah, Cate, how does intermittent fasting affect the gut biome?
It's essential. So dysbiotic, if we look at the microbiome, we'll start to use some different words. There's dysbiosis and eubiosis. So eubiosis is the harmonic species diversity that feeds DNA cells, human DNA cells. Dysbiosis is usually 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 types of microbes that are growing out of control and displacing the eubiotic populations. So anyone that has chronic inflammation, anyone that has a disease of chronic inflammation, anyone who has like chronically inflamed sinuses, or say you have itchy skin or scaly skin, or say you have tooth decay or gum decay, those are all signs that there's microbiomes all over the body, that those particular microbiomes are having an increased dysbiotic microbial population. So more dysbiosis. So if we look at intermittent fasting, the fasting preferences the feeding cycles of the eubiotic bacteria and viruses. Eating too frequently, meaning like having less than a 16-hour fast most of the time, that will preference the dysbiosis to continue to breed and populate. So yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And it doesn't mean that you have to fast, every single day for 16 hours. It just seems like most of the time, especially for children, it's a little bit different. For children, a 13-hour fast is good. For teens, 14 to 15-hour fasts a few times a week are good. By your late teens, getting more 16 to 18-hour fasts a few times a week. And that'll just keep preferencing circadian rhythm. You'll sleep better, you'll absorb better, you'll have a stronger appetite, but you'll also be more relaxed more of the time. That's one of the trademarks of intermittent fasters, is that they're just more calm, they experience more focus. So it feeds brain function. Fasting feeds brain function. And part of that is just the healthy microbiome sets the circadian rhythm for the human DNA cells. So the more we disrupt healthy microbiome by eating too frequently, we're feeding dysbiosis, we're disrupting our own circadian rhythm, which means it's harder to get deeper rest. It's harder to get deeper nutrient absorption. It's harder to have more balanced moods because it'll affect your serotonin and your melatonin.
And what about for athletes? If somebody is really, really, really active, and they're training really hard, and when it comes to fasting for them?
Yeah, the research actually shows that you want to exercise in a fasted state. So yeah, you want to like get your first workout of the day in while you're fasting, and then what'll happen is you'll have better access to your fat cells. So fat cells release a more sustained flow of energy. And then when you're hungry, you're going to crave protein and fat. You're going to crave nutrient density. So you won't crave like the power bars or the little, whatever they're called, those little like gel shots or that kind of shit, right? Like you'll actually crave deep nutrition. And that means that you're exercising in a fasted state. It also means that you're probably going to really have pretty high caloric intake, right? When you do eat. Like you're not going to hold back. And that's just the natural cycle. I mean, it's cool to look back and see the different indigenous tribes that were running marathons, like the Japanese monks who would run barefoot in the snow, or the Haromara down in Mexico. And fasting rhythm was part of their cultural rituals.
Right. And so a farmer who's on the go all the time, they would also benefit from these longer fasts.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that long. Like really, like a 16-8 is fine, like a 16-hour fasting window and an 8-hour feeding window. So I would say for a farmer, you might want more nutrition earlier in the day, right? If you even look back at like the farm had dinner was lunch, right? And supper was something supplemental. So if you just look at like life back in the farm, because you're waking up and you're milking the cows and you're raking the manure, like you have massive caloric burn before 10 a.m., you would want your main meal way closer to noon, not at 6 o'clock at night, right? And so, planning ahead for that is really important. For some of you, that means using like using a instant pot and having food cooking while you're out doing stuff. So you walk into a good, hot, nutrient-dense meal in the middle of the day, and then just being done eating. So say your fasting time is an 8-hour window, you might do 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Have your main meal somewhere around noon, and then have a second meal around 6. Others of you who can't fast in the morning, the research actually shows it's much better to not fast in the morning and have an eating window from like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. I know a lot of people can't do that in the modern lifestyle with kids and family dinners and that sort of thing. But yeah, you can get creative with it for sure. And it doesn't have to be the same every day either. What we know is that like humans are really benefited by what's called metabolic flexibility, which is where you increase the variation. So some days you may have a 4-hour fasting or like a 4-hour feeding window, and other days you may have a 10-hour feeding window. And that variability is what will give you the most resilience and adaptability in your cells.
I love this because it's really amplifying flexibility and being adaptable. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from gardening, right? Is that we learn to be observers, we learn to be collaborators, and we learn to notice what's working and what's not working. And so I just would like to bridge part of the conversation with you, Cate, as how much of an opportunity we have as we work with food to reflect on what our relationship with food is beyond the food that we're growing, and its impact that it has on our emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual ethos.
I know we all feel more connected when we're gardening, whether we're in the planting phase or the harvesting phase or just cleaning stuff up and moving stuff around, but we become part of the integrated ecosystem, our consciousness and the plant's consciousness. We can feel it. We can feel the mix. We can feel that there's something about the human being and the cultivation of these beds, right, that we nurture and that we care for, and that then become our bodies. And the more integrated we are in just the piece of the cycles of that and how time works. This is something that really fascinated me when I was writing my second book, Master of You. There's a chapter in there on space and how we design our consciousness from the spaces that we design. And I know for me, from like my greenhouse and my gardens and the spaces that I design, and when I'm in those spaces, I try not to be too plugged in. Like I don't like the headset. I don't like listening to podcasts or doing things. I just want to like listen to the plants. When I'm harvesting, when I'm wildcrafting in the woods, one of the things I noticed, it naturally happens. Like those of you who, if there's rose hips from last season and you pick the rose hip and you start chewing on it for the vitamin C and for the taste in your mouth and for just the feeling of wildness in your blood, you'll notice that you'll probably spit some of the seeds out. So I just started to like dig a little hole, spit into the hole, cover the seeds, right? And these are just natural parts of recovering our primal consciousness, that we're always part of the ecosystems that we're living in, and we can be seed planters no matter really where we are. I've taken people on like urban foraging tours at my events. I do events in like random places. So we were in South Dakota a couple of years ago, and I'm like, let's go in the hills. And we were in the hills, and I'm like, we found 10 plants to eat on the walk, and then we found seeds to plant along the way. And to me, that's all part of our natural regenerative consciousness as humans and plants and ecosystems. And there's something so cool about that. Like if you harvest the rose hip, well, maybe someone else planted that, or maybe an animal pooped it out 100 years ago, and that plant's just been regenerating in that one spot since then. And there's something about that, like continuing of the cycle when we replant, in places that you feel called to be in.
Yeah, I feel you on that. And I'm also wondering, you talked about regenerative consciousness, and I'm wondering if you can connect that to something. You talk a lot about primal habits, and we're talking about growing our own food today. Can you expand a little bit more on that and how we can bring that awareness and consciousness into our practice?
Yeah, so for me, My life brought me really into like what works for the planets and humans over time. That was more or less as a teenager what I dedicated my life to, and it brought me into higher levels consciousness type training and Ayurvedic medicine and yoga type training, and then it brought me eventually to pre-agriculture of like what were we doing before agriculture, and that's what I'm calling primal. So primal are the habits that we had before we were reliant on agriculture. And I'm not suggesting that we're not reliant on agriculture at all. What I am suggesting though is that part of our consciousness really wakes up in our experience of what the yogis call svadhyaya. Sva means self and dhya means wisdom, that our self wisdom wakes up. The word for health in Ayurveda is svastha, and it's that same sva, which means self, and stha, which means seated in. So we get really deeply seated in ourself as the creator and the creation. So it's very different than like projecting faith outward. It's actually then it's grounded inward towards self. And the primal habits wake that up. They wake up our svastha, our rootedness in ourself. They wake up our svadhyaya, or our n equals one. Your study where, the participants of the study are one, you, and your ability to self-know, your ability to self-reflect. So if you're wondering if a plant is good for you, you taste it, you feel it, you notice what it does. If you notice like you feel shit one day, you think, what did I do yesterday? How did I create this? And you learn from that. In Ayurvedic medicine, there's three causes of disease, and the main cause is failure. It's called failure of the intellect. It's a failure to learn from your own past experiences and not mistakes, because we have our experiences. We're continually experiencing. We're all experiencing each other right now, right? If you find a conversation super resonant, you're like, yeah, I want more of this. And then if you don't follow through on that, right, then that's not learning from your experience. Same thing with like if you take a meal at a restaurant and you're like, I did the other night, I had Thai food with my husband, we went on date night. Like I hadn't been eating sugar for months. Like there's so much sugar in this Thai food. I had mixed vegetables with tofu. Like there's so much sugar in the sauce, right? So I learned from that and say like, I'm not gonna take a meal at that restaurant anymore. Right? Because I don't like to have that much sugar in my taste, because it alters how your taste buds are super relative. So whatever you're used to lately is what they're going to crave tomorrow. And I don't want to crave sugar. So that ability to learn from yourself, that's really what the primal habits wake up. Now, you're all gardeners, which means you're super close to the earth. You're super close to the elements. And I just suggest that the more you want to learn from the elements and from the plants, like just ask questions to the sky and the earth, ask questions to the sun and the rain, like ask questions to the plants in your gardens, and you will have intuitive insights. I promise. And whenever you're really frustrated with your garden or like something not growing, like ask questions without knowing, and you'll receive insight. And this insight will come directly from how our ancients would receive information about how to cultivate plants and how to work with the elements. And it'll bring you on a highly intuitive journey back into self-wisdom.
What have you learned from practicing that in your own walk with gardening and eating wild weeds?
I mean, abundance. I think, those of you who study the Tao Te Ching, like the one begets the two, and the two begets the three, and the three begets the 10,000. The 10,000 things, it's that. I mean, I bought a piece of property a couple years ago, and it's on a creek, and it's rich in service berries and choke cherries and tons of thistle. It's got a total out of control weed problem from previous disturbance. And just the abundance, like when the first year I tried to pick all of the service berries, like me and the birds, were out there. And my dog was a puppy at the time, and she just became a service berry addict. Now, service berries, they're also called Saskatoon berries or June berries. A lot of people don't like them because they're super high in pectin, right? They're really high in fiber. But I found if I dried them, that I would just snack on them like year round. I'd freeze them also, and do just various things with service berries. But mostly I dry them and I eat them that way. Well, the thing of it is, like, I ended up with like gallons and gallons of service berries. And so then I would gift them at Christmas time, right? I'd gift like my own little trail mix to my family and friends that are skiers. And just the sheer abundance, like when we really tune in and when we're really in that collaborative relationship with our ecosystem, we experience insane abundance. And that enables us to gift, right? It enables us to have so much that we give away. And I think for most farmers that we're really enriched, our lives are enriched, and the people who know us are enriched because of that natural abundance. That's part of nature. That's part of our nature. So that's just something I just want to celebrate in all of you, as you know, as your garden will simply produce too much of something, even if it's the weeds of dandelion and thistle that you can make into green powder.
Yeah, Jocelyn says she puts them into her porridge in the mornings with other berries from her organic garden. Yum, delicious. So if you have any questions for Cate, I'd love for you to drop them in the chat, because we've gone in a lot of directions. And Cate is she has multiple books out, and we could probably spend months or years with Cate learning from her and rewilding our health and connecting more deeply with nature and our gardens and really our habits around gardening and our awareness around just who we are and what we're learning and what's opening up. So if you have any questions about anything to do with health or weeds, or, can you eat a certain weed? Do you have a lot of weeds growing? What can you do with them? Drop them in the chat. Bob says, sea buckthorn, goji berries, elderberries, milk thistle. What do you think, Cate?
Yeah, everything. So the Native Americans were using over 1,200 species of plants in North America. And when you think about that, that's like, it's so hard to fathom. Like, just count the number of species that you plant in your garden. Like, if some of you get close to 50, that's impressive, really, right? 5, yeah, like 5, 10. I might be at like 20 on it, like a good year. So what I look at, Bob, is I look at the species diversity, because every different species is going to have a different nutrient profile. So you're going to get nutrient density. You're going to get different vitamins and minerals and things that we don't even know. These phytonutrients, some of which we've identified and some of which we haven't even identified yet. And to me, that's where it really gets interesting. Diversity is the bottom line in health. Microbial diversity and nutrient diversity. Even a diversity in movement. Like, if you only go for walks, it's like, no, you got to mix it up. Like, we got to mix up how we move. So yes to that. Even goji berries, we used to grow them in our greenhouse. The leaves have a crazy high nutrient density. Goji berry leaves. So anyone growing goji berries, make sure that you put some of those leaves in your green smoothies or your green juice.
That's a great tip.
The book I recommend, Maria, is The Wisdom of Wild Weeds by Katrina Blair, Blair. It's a super beautiful book. It's a recipe book. Katrina had a foraging cafe in Crested Butte, Colorado. The other thing about the weeds, like thistle, they can be used as to control weed populations. So she would make these massive decoctions of like thistle, and then she'd spray massive fields. And so they created a no-spray county in Crested Butte, Colorado, thanks to the work of Katrina Blair. Absolutely. She talks about it in the book. There's a few podcasts I recorded with her. If you look up Thrive with Cate, Yoga Healer, that podcast, and type in Katrina Blair, there's a few really good interviews on how to use weeds for weed control. Kind of wild.
Yeah, and I think biodynamics, they will burn the weed seeds, and then pepper. It's called peppering. So burn the weed seeds, and then you sprinkle those ashes on the areas where the weeds are growing, and then Korean natural farming. I think they'll do fermenting of the different weeds to apply those back onto the fields to help with weed suppression. So fascinating. Karen is asking if you could recommend any she says, what would Cate recommend for our communities to promote weed culture and biodiversity?
I would look up the work of Katrina Blair because she'll talk about how she worked with the county on that, because they did change policy. I think most of us that are in, like, I'm in the West, and it's, you know, it's pro spraying, it's pro yeah, it's a lot of the petrochemicals, right? They end up then in the water, they end up affecting human health and ecosystem health and all that. So yeah, it's exciting that there's at least one county that has shown that you can do it differently.
That's really cool. What are some edible weeds that will come back every year? I guess that depends on what part of the world you're in. So maybe you could let us know where you are, John. And he says he uses leeks and black salsify and earth chestnut nipwort. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I mean, this is a really good question about the native plants versus the invasives. So I'm pro-invasive. So I'm pro eating invasives because they're in an abundance that overtake native populations. And the more we're using petrochemicals in our large scale farming, the more our native plant communities are really struggling in their diversity. So I tend not to harvest native plant populations unless it's like where I live out here, there's a ton of nettle. It is invasive, but it's also native. So I can eat as much nettle as I want because we're not going to suffer from a shortage of that. But other plants, I'll be for example, Oregon graperoot is very similar to golden seal, and golden seal was dramatically over-harvested by the herbalists back in the 80s and 90s, and it became endangered. So the Oregon graperoot, even though it's everywhere where I live, I almost never take the root unless it's just in a massive field of Oregon graperoot, and then I'll take a little bit because our forests are already struggling with desertification, right? With just a drier climate, more forest fires, etc. Yeah. And then what I try to do is like the seed saver thing, is I try to take more and more of the of the native plants that are in the ecosystem around me, and I bring them into my yard, and then I cultivate them more in my yard to rewild my yard. So that's where I've gotten like my sorrel and my amaranth and my Oregon graperoot and my chokecherry and that sort of thing.
And do you just have a special area of your yard that you're cultivating?
I just try everywhere and see where that species wants to hang out. Yeah. And you guys, I'm a total hack gardener. Like, I will keep saying this, like, I'm really not a super green thumb. Yeah.
But you're super great at rewilding and wildcrafting. So that's, I think, where our growth edge is with you, right? Because as gardeners, our frame of mind is often, I'm growing food, I'm growing carrots and beets and potatoes and lettuce and celery and all the things, right? And I'm pulling out these bloody effing thistles and all chickweed and another really annoying one is, what is it? Quackgrass, like couch grass, which I found out, I don't know if you probably already know this, is the roots are edible. They used to actually make
grasses are edible.
Yeah. Who knew? I never knew. Yeah. So
and you can just juice, a lot of this stuff too, you can just juice it because if you have it in so much abundance. So you can make like celery and wild weed juice. And you're just going to get so many more minerals into your body from that. And then just take the pulp, put the pulp back in the compost. I'm sure you guys are talking about composting, but like to me, composting is just, good. Yeah. Yeah. So water your compost with pea too, and it'll have more nitrogen in it.
So what kind of pea?
Your pea, just dump it in your compost. Yeah. Water it down when you're adding nitrogen to your beds, like that's watered down, and just notice what happens. Just notice what it does. Pea also feeds the microbiome. So you can use it in your skin, you can use it in your mouth, your hair, anywhere. Any of your microbiomes love urine. And humans have known that. This is very primal. It is in every indigenous culture if you go far enough back. All mammals use their pee, but humans were actually really good at collecting it, and it ferments over time. So it becomes more, again, higher in growth hormone, higher in stem cells over in time, and it turns into a medicine. The
Yeah.
Buddha talked about it. It shows up in all of these ancient texts. It shows up in the Bible. It shows up in Buddhism. It shows up in every First People's medicinals.
Yeah, so I just want to invite everyone to just drop a one in the chat if you want to learn more about this, and we might just go there anyways, because I think the rewilding piece, I'm seeing some ones. Yeah, the rewilding piece of our health and the connection to our own resources is like it's more than invigorating. It's so there's just so much agency in it.
Yeah.
And you know, Cate, like when I first learned about urine therapy and my polarity therapy training, and learned that it treated you know, like really severe cases of X, Y, and Z. I don't even remember what it was, but I remember thinking at the time, well, if it would help with somebody who's on like death row and beyond cure, I was curious about what its impact would be on a normal human, because if it can reverse a chronic illness, then couldn't it help a regular health too? And that just kind of sat in the edges of my consciousness. And polarity is based in Ayurvedic and Chinese and ancient Hermetic sciences as well. So and then when I saw you kind of resurf it a few years ago, I was like, I dove in. I was super curious about it. So tell us about, just touch on it.
Well, yeah. So we were talking before about the microbiome and our loss of microbial diversity. And I can see someone typed in the chat, Leslie, like, but isn't pee the body's waste product? What it doesn't need? What we can see is that you guys are all counterculture by being gardeners, right? You've all taken yourself out of the consumer stream by producing your own food for yourselves and your family. So you're already counterculture. We can see with primal habits, almost every primal habit is counterculture. So in my book on Inflamed, the 21 Primal Habits, there's 4 chapters on how to use on pee as medicine, on urine therapy. Out of the 21 wild habits, 4 of them are pee, and by far it's the most rewilding of the habits that are in that book. So if we look at where urine comes from, it's called ultraplasma filtrate. It comes out of the blood plasma, right? So it's already in your blood, and then your body is upcycling. There's a water cycle of your body. You pee it out. If you re-ingest it, that's called upcycling. So what happens in the easiest way to start to see what it does without totally grossing yourself out is just when you go pee, put a few drops on one hand, like just choose your left hand and just put a few drops on your left hand every single time you go pee, and notice in a week what your skin feels like on your left hand and what your skin feels like on your right hand. And you will have a tangible experience of what it's like to nourish the microbiome of your skin microbiome. Now, those of you who get really dry, chapped hands, and this will totally gross some of you out, but you can soak your hands in urine, and the older the urine, the more urea, because some of the water will evaporate. So then the urea concentrate will get deeper. Urea, the last study we did on humans and urea on skin was done in 1970, and it was for skin carcinoma. 90% of the people in the study reversed their carcinoma on their skin within 3 years of using urine. And that was the last study that was ever done. Urine does not make anyone any money in the pharmaceutical companies because you produce it all by yourself. So it is a crazy habit. A lot of the primal habits, again, have been cultured out of us. So it's easier to control populations by turning them into consumers. And what the primal habits do is they actually take you out of the consumer stream, just like you're experiencing from growing your own food. They take you out of the consumer stream. They put you back into nutrient density. So now not only do you not need to buy your food, but you don't need to buy supplements because you already have all the vitamins and minerals. The closer you are to the soil, the closer you are to your cow, your neighbor's cow, putting nutrient diversity and microbial and even viral diversity back in the soil, back into your food, back into your experience.
So we hear a lot about the microbiome and the healthy bacteria in the soil, and you've mentioned the viral microbes as well. So can you expand on those a little bit? And because that's some of the people's fear, right? We're taught we are taught kind of
To fear.
to fear viruses, and we're also taught in regular, I'll say regular gardening, to sterilize our soil and to sterilize our seeds before planting. And we don't teach that in the heart and soil space or in the organic gardening space or regenerative space, but that has been the narrative for I don't know how long, how many decades, but and now we're hearing that the bacteria is good, the microbes are good, and now you're saying the viruses are good. So expand on that.
Yeah, right. Because science changes over time, right? Does everyone remember, like, before microbiome, we thought bacteria was bad,
Mm-hmm.
right? With all bacteria, it's funny. It's like in the 1970s, if you read the articles there, it's like bacteria is bad, and then all of a sudden we discovered that there's this microbiome. Then we discovered that the microbiome is an organ that we're completely dependent on for the health of our cells, that we're actually dependent on, like I mentioned before, for circadian rhythm, which is like your body knowing when it's time to go to bed and when it's time to wake up. It regulates every system of the body, every neurotransmitter and hormone in the body is regulated by the microbiome. So the virome is called it's called the black hole of science right now, because it's like 10,000 times bigger than the biome. So biome usually refers to the bacteria, but there's way more viruses, and viruses, they adapt much more quickly than the bacteria do, but they feed the bacteria and they feed the human DNA cells. So back in the day with like Louis Pasteur, there was another scientist, his last name is Bernard, and they were having a debate between germ theory and terrain theory. And around the same time, Roosevelt put a lot of money into the chemical industry and started to take over medical colleges with chemicals, which became pharmaceuticals, which happened to kill a lot of viruses and bacteria. So germ theory won out in a consumer culture. And we all sort of bought into germ theory, I think, during COVID, where it's like this fear of the virus. But if we look at what happened to the wild deer and what happened to even the dogs, even the household dogs during COVID, is they didn't get sick from COVID. They got the virus, but they didn't get sick. And that is a direct reflection, like how sick people got is more or less a direct correlation to how robust the terrain was, how robust their microbial diversity was, the viruses and the bacteria. So right now, in terms of what's happening in the science, they're starting to map the virome, the human virome. The DOE had to be a partner on the mapping of the microbiome project because it took so much energy to run the computers to be able to basically map with that great degree of specificity. So there's just a lot. There's just like, it's just a ginormous undertaking. We only understand about, what I've read is like 1/100th of a human virome that we've mapped out. So we don't really understand how codependent we are on diversity of viruses. Many of you probably read Michael Pollan's his gardening book, and where he talks about how the typical human in the United States today only eats 30 plant species a year. And before I mentioned, like, the Native Americans were using like 1,200 species. What we know is like the diversity of species has more bacteria and viruses related to each of the species. So diversity is really the key.
I think diversity is a theme. Everyone's talking about it at every single session. It's come up, I think, in every session is diversity. Diversity is key. Diversity in our gut, in our gardens.
So the urine, just to go back to the urine, what the farmers of the past used to know, because they used to use urine for everything, right? As fertilizer, they used to use it it's kind of crazy. It works as an antiseptic and an antiviral to the dysbiotic viruses. So it's kind of wild, like just on the skin and the mouth, and the nose. They'd use it to heal farm animals. They would wrap farm animals' wounds in pee and poop, bandage it so that the microbial diversity would. It's like the absolute opposite of what we've been taught with antiseptic and being sanitary. Yeah, wild.
Fascinating. Denise says, what about the idea that plants give off defensive chemicals because they don't want to be eaten?
Yeah, so those defensive chemicals are are medicinals, right? They're phytonutrients, and they're the strongest of the medicinals, right? If we look at the hottest peppers, right? They're so hot you can't eat that many, but they're also medicinal because just like a little bit will clear all the mucus out of your sinuses. And same thing with like the extreme bitters, more like neem and gentian and golden seal, Oregon grapefruit. These ones that are their phytochemicals are the super bitters. Now, it's a question again, and then we'll just go back to diversity. It's a question of like a little bit of all of these things is what awakens the palate. And the palate, there's receptors, there's even bitter receptors up in the sinuses, up in the parasinuses, which are feeding the cerebrospinal fluid through the olfactory bulb. So you get high level cognitive function when you have a diversity of diet, including all those defensive chemicals, which are some of the medicinals. Those are like highly medicinal chemicals. But what we also see is that dose really matters, right? Because too much cayenne and you can't eat the food, right? Too bitter of a medicine and you can really damage your nervous system. So it's like really just enough. And palate is so important. This is why I think most of you here know, like you want to taste your medicines, right? You want to chew on them, you want to taste them, you want to get that information in your mouth, and your mouth will tell you what to spit or swallow. And so really getting a lot of the conventional food out of your system, getting sugar, which is not a food, it's a commodity, getting that out, and getting a lot of the processed, what fillers just out. What you can do is like really awaken your taste and your palate, and then you'll know like exactly how much of a plant is going to be healing for your body and how much is actually going to create a neurotoxin.
That's so cool. Cate, how has gardening, and I'll say wildcrafting, impacted your health emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually?
I think that there's this word in Sanskrit that it means it's niralambaya, and it means like without limbs. It's like being supported from within. And to me, wildcrafting has that, like where you're just like the world is the nature, the ecosystem is feeding you. Whether it's a dandelion or nettle or a thistle or eventually the berries will come out. Where I live, the snow comes in so fast and hard that a lot of the berries get dried on the stem. So they're available in the spring. Just that sense of like this living seasonally, eating seasonally, wildcrafting seasonally, it gives you what you need. It gives you a sense of being supported without needing to really self-provide, like really the sense that like what created nature, and that is supportive. And then that naturally, and it naturally transfers to you a desire to give back. Right? And that full cycle of like you're supported, and so you can support others. You can have compassion for people that live in the food deserts. You can share your wisdom and your love and your care with your neighbors. And there really, to me, is something for that. We had neighbors move in the other day, and I made them banana bread. I made it gluten-free because I imagined someone in the house would be gluten-free. And there's just that sense of like gifting each other because nature gifts us. I feel like that's what gardening and wildcrafting really gave me. Because I grew up in a pretty consumer culture, pretty much like, just targeted to make money, buy insurance, have the job, and, just be kind of caught up in consumerism. And for me, gardening and wildcrafting helped pull my consciousness into a much higher order.
It's very cool. So it's pretty special to have the opportunity to hop into these conversations in the Gardening Summit and to be online with you right now. And I'm just curious, what's one thing that you don't get asked enough or about very often that you really want people to know and understand?
I mean, we already covered most of the controversial stuff, so I don't know. For me, I just want to say we haven't really talked about like really being outside of consumer culture, but like living your best life and redefining how you use your time and your energy and your focus, your attention, and attuning that to purpose. That's really what we do in Club Thrive. And what I find is that right now what really matters is community. Like if you look in any good garden that there's diversity, there's like a strong community of plants, right? Anywhere where when I go later today and I walk my land, like I'll notice the diversity and the communities of plants. And I just find that like summits like this, Natalie, it's like where we're bringing people together of a higher consciousness. The clubs that you belong to really matter, right? Like investing in the people that you're spending time with and at the vibration of your own growth edge. To me, that's really what turns an ordinary life and into an extraordinary life, because it ignites your unique potential. And everyone has that within them. That's part of the definition of health. It's part of that svasta, is really being seated in your gifts, being seated in your potential, and being networked where that's supported.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for creating. I think you do a good job at creating community, Cate. You always have since I met you. I think it was before I even before we met at that training that we were at together. I found you online, and I just, one thing that I've always appreciated about you is the community that you create and the space that you hold for people. And I just want to say thanks for sharing so openly here and so vulnerably about some of the rewilding primal habits that you deeply believe in, and for helping us think about gardening maybe a little bit differently than we might have culturally understood gardening. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Really fun to be with you guys. And thanks for putting this on, Leslie and Natalie. Really, I know it takes a lot of effort to do a summit, and great job. And what a crucial topic right now. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you can go find Cate and follow her on Instagram at Yoga Healer. And you can find her clubthrive.global at Club Thrive. And we'll throw these links are on the website as well, and in the VIP upgrade. She's also has a fabulous YouTube channel and a podcast, which she's relaunching again, right? You're going back there.
Yeah, it's up. Yeah.
Yeah. So her podcast is fascinating, covering all sorts of things from drinking your own urine to planting potatoes to nutrient dense weeds to
actually right now there'll be a bunch coming out on Uplevel Your Life. I just created a new mini course on how to uplevel your life. Actually, if anyone wants that, I will give you a promo code so you can get it for free. Just send me an email at cate@clubthrive.global. And I'll send that to you. But yeah, the next few podcasts are all going to be about upleveling your potential, and I highlight the chapters in Uninflamed on purpose, your focus, and your community, and the habit of forgiveness, including self-forgiveness. So those will all be coming out shortly.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you, Cate. Big love. And thank you to each of you for joining. And thank you for the incredible work you're doing, growing your own food. And really, when you are a gardener and when you're working with the earth, you are a global leader.